Halloween had always been something special in our small town, and not in the cheerful way most people expected. Unlike the typical celebrations filled with trick-or-treaters and costume parades, Halloween here carried a legacy, a chilling aura that had nothing to do with decorations or candy. It was as if the entire town held its breath each year, feeling the weight of something sinister lurking just beneath the surface. And every whisper, every rumor of strange happenings, pointed to one place, Ravenwood Manor. The manor sat on a hill on the outskirts of town, its silhouette casting an ominous shadow over the entire area. It was a grand structure, or at least it had been, in the days before time and decay wore it down to its current, foreboding state. Windows were shattered or boarded up, and ivy crawled up the crumbling walls, snaking its way through every crack and crevice. The mere sight of it could make the hairs on the back of anyone's neck stand on end, and stories about the manor had been passed down for generations. For as long as anyone could remember, people said that the house was haunted. There were tales of a family who had once lived there, a family that disappeared mysteriously one Halloween night. According to legend, they were last seen alive at a town festival, laughing and dancing. But when they returned home, they were never heard from again. Some claimed they had fallen victim to a curse, others spoke of vengeful spirits that had taken their lives, but no one knew for sure. All anyone knew was that after that night, Ravenwood Manor was abandoned, and the townspeople treated it as though it were infected with something foul. Every Halloween, the daring and the foolish alike would challenge each other to spend a night in the manor, but most people barely lasted an hour before running back into town, wide-eyed and pale-faced. The stories they brought back varied. Some spoke of ghostly whispers, others of shadows moving in ways shadows shouldn't, but every tale had one thing in common: terror. No one had ever stayed until dawn, and no one wanted to. Yet somehow every year, someone took the dare, and the tradition continued. This year, it was my turn. My friends dared me, and though I was reluctant, I found myself unable to back down. My pride was on the line, and I wasn't about to let them think I was afraid. But as I stood at the gates of Ravenwood Manor that fateful Halloween night, I could feel my confidence waning. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for that time of year, and an eerie silence hung in the air. I took a deep breath, trying to steel my nerves, and stepped through the gates. The inside of the manor was worse than I had imagined. Dust and cobwebs covered every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew. I shone my flashlight around, illuminating faded wallpaper and cracked tiles, and something about the place felt wrong. It was as though the very walls were watching me, waiting for me to make a wrong move. I wandered through the dark, empty halls, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The wind howled outside, and the floor creaked under my weight, each sound sending a shiver down my spine. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath, hitting it against my palm until it steadied. But as I moved deeper into the manor, I began to notice something strange. Shadows seemed to shift and move in the corners of my vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I could feel a chill creeping up my spine, and I started to question whether this was really a good idea. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, so quiet I almost missed it. I froze, straining my ears, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew better. There was something in the house with me, something that didn't want me there. I moved to the staircase, my heart pounding in my chest, and made my way up to the second floor. The air felt heavier up here, as though an invisible weight was pressing down on me. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I shone my flashlight down the hallway, illuminating a row of doors that seemed to stretch on forever. As I walked, I noticed that the doors were all slightly ajar, each one creaking open just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beyond. I didn't dare look inside. But as I passed the last door, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like the sound of fingernails drumming against wood. It was coming from the room at the end of the hall, a room I knew from the stories was once the master bedroom. My friends had told me about this room, about the things people claimed to have seen in there. Some said they had seen the family, their ghostly figures frozen in a macabre dance. Others claimed to have seen shadows moving in ways that defied explanation. But no one had ever stayed long enough to find out what was really in there. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from my flashlight, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. I scanned the room, my heart racing, and that's when I saw it, a figure standing in the corner, its back turned to me. It was tall and thin, its skin pale and almost translucent, and it wore what looked like a tattered, old-fashioned suit. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, and I could feel my hands shaking as I held the flashlight. The figure didn't move, didn't turn to look at me, but somehow, I knew it was aware of my presence. I wanted to run, to turn and flee, but I couldn't move. It was as though I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away. And then, slowly, the figure began to turn. Its face was a twisted mask of horror, its eyes empty sockets, and its mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure took a step toward me, its movements slow and deliberate, and I knew I had to get out. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, and I could hear footsteps behind me, growing louder with each passing second. I flew down the stairs, barely aware of my surroundings, and burst out the front door, gasping for air. I didn't stop running until I was back in town, my legs shaking and my heart racing. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I looked back, expecting to see the figure standing there, watching me. But the manor was empty, its dark silhouette looming over the town like a silent sentinel. I knew then that I would never set foot in that place again, and I would never forget the face of the thing that had followed me. From that night on, I understood why Ravenwood Manor was feared, and why every year, people dared each other to go inside. It wasn't about courage or bravery. It was a test, a way to prove to yourself that you could face the darkness and come out the other side. But for me, that night had changed everything. I had seen what lay hidden in the shadows, and I knew that some places were better left alone. There's something about Halloween that feels different in Hollow's End, a sleepy town tucked between dark hills and dense forests. Every October 31st, an unnatural chill falls over the town, and residents stay indoors, locking windows and bolting doors. Hollow's End isn't like other towns on Halloween. It's haunted by something ancient, a curse, as old as the trees and twice as frightening. No one knew exactly where the curse came from or what triggered it. Most believed it had to do with the old Hollow family, the town's founders. Some claimed the family practiced dark magic, tampering with powers best left alone. Others said they made a pact with something dark, binding their family, and the town to an eternity of horror. And when the last hollow vanished over a century ago, the curse remained. Growing up in Hollow's End, we all knew the stories. Parents would tell their children about the curse to keep them indoors, warning them that the spirits of the Hollow family roamed the town on Halloween night, looking for souls to claim. I never believed it, not until last year. That is, I had returned to Hollow's End for a visit, the first in a long time. The town looked much the same as I remembered, though there was an eerie emptiness to it that made me uneasy. The old building sagged with age, and every shadow seemed to hold a memory of something sinister. I shrugged it off, dismissing it as nerves. After all, it was Halloween, and the stories had always given me chills, even as a kid. I met up with some friends from high school that night, all of us eager to laugh at the curse we once feared. We decided to spend the evening exploring the abandoned Hollow mansion. No one had set foot in it for decades, and it was rumored to be the epicenter of the curse. Part of me wanted to back out, but I wasn't about to be the only one left behind. We gathered flashlights, bundled up against the cold, and made our way up the winding hill to the mansion. The night was dark and still, not a single light to guide our way, and the air seemed to grow colder as we neared the estate. My stomach twisted with a mix of excitement and dread, and I glanced at my friends, hoping to find some reassurance in their faces, but they looked just as uneasy as I felt. When we reached the mansion, its imposing form loomed against the night sky like a giant skeleton, its broken windows staring down at us like empty eyes. The house was a crumbling ruin, vines and moss covering the cracked stone walls. The front door was hanging open, creaking in the faint wind, and as we stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were trespassing on something ancient and angry. The air inside the mansion was thick and stale, and every step we took echoed through the empty halls. We wandered from room to room, our flashlights casting eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper and the broken furniture scattered across the floor. The deeper we went into the house, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. It was as though something was lurking in the shadows, following us, waiting for the right moment to strike. As we explored, we found ourselves in what appeared to be the old library. The room was filled with dusty books, some of which had titles that sent shivers down my spine. Books on dark magic, curses, and the occult. It was as though the Hollow family had collected every forbidden piece of knowledge they could find, and I felt a strange sense of foreboding as I looked around. One book in particular caught my eye, an old leather-bound tome with the Hollow family crest stamped on the cover. Against my better judgment, I reached out and opened it. The book was filled with strange symbols and rituals, most of which I couldn't understand, but one page stood out. It spoke of a ritual to summon the spirits of the dead, a way to bring them back to this world for one night. My hands trembled as I read the words, and I could feel the air in the room growing colder. I snapped the book shut, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me, but it was too late. A sudden, bone-chilling wind swept through the room, extinguishing our flashlights. We stumbled in the darkness, fumbling for our phones, but none of them would turn on. Panic set in as we realized we were trapped in the dark, alone in a haunted mansion. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, we heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the halls. My friends and I froze, too terrified to move, as the footsteps drew closer. We could feel something approaching, something that didn't belong in this world. A faint, ghostly glow appeared in the hallway outside the library, and we huddled together, whispering frantic prayers, hoping it would go away. But the glow grew brighter, and soon we could see them, figures dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes empty as they stared at us. One of my friends let out a strangled scream, and that seemed to snap us all out of our paralysis. We ran, sprinting through the dark halls, desperate to find a way out. But no matter where we turned, the house seemed to shift and change, leading us in circles. The spirits were everywhere, their silent figures appearing at every turn, their eyes watching us with a hunger that made my blood run cold. Finally, we found ourselves in the main hall, the front door just a few feet away. But as we reached for the handle, a figure appeared in front of us, blocking our path. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered black gown, her hair wild and matted, her eyes burning with a dark, malevolent fire. I knew, in that moment, that we were staring at the last of the Hollow family. Her voice was a whisper, barely more than a breath, but it echoed through the hall like thunder. "You have disturbed the dead," she said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at us. "And now, you must pay the price." The next thing I knew, I was waking up on the hill outside the mansion, my friends lying around me, unconscious. When we came to, none of us could remember how we had escaped. The only thing we remembered was the woman's face, her eyes burning into our souls. We stumbled back to town, shaken and terrified, and none of us spoke of what had happened. But since that night, things have been different. We're haunted by strange dreams, visions of the mansion, and the spirits within it. And every Halloween, I feel the pull to return, as though something in the house is calling me back, waiting for me to fulfill the bargain I made that night. I know I can't escape it forever. The Hollow family is waiting, and one day, they'll come for me. In college, Halloween was the one night we all looked forward to. My friends and I had a tradition of hosting the most extravagant Halloween parties in town. But last Halloween, things went horribly wrong, and none of us have been able to forget it. The plan was to throw the party at the old Sinclair Manor on the outskirts of town. The place had been abandoned for years, and we'd heard all sorts of creepy legends about it. The locals said the mansion was cursed, that anyone who spent Halloween night there would vanish without a trace. But to us, it was perfect, the perfect setting for a Halloween party to end all Halloween parties. We decorated the place with fake cobwebs, spooky lights, and even hired someone to come dressed as the Grim Reaper to wander through the house and scare people. There was no cell service in the area, but we figured it added to the authenticity. We brought enough supplies to last all night, intending to make this an event no one would forget. The night started off like any other Halloween party. People were dancing, drinking, and telling ghost stories. The air was filled with laughter, and the atmosphere was electric. But around midnight, things started to feel off. The temperature dropped suddenly, and a thick fog rolled in from nowhere, enveloping the house and cutting off any view of the outside. Then, the lights began to flicker. At first, we thought it was just the old wiring, but then the lights went out completely. Some people thought it was a prank, laughing and lighting candles, but the laughter died down when we heard footsteps echoing through the empty halls, heavy, deliberate footsteps that grew louder and louder. One of my friends, Jenna, suggested we check the generator in the basement, thinking it might be a simple fix. I volunteered to go with her, and we made our way through the dark, using our phones as flashlights. The house was unnaturally quiet, and every creak and groan of the old wood made my heart race. When we reached the basement door, it was slightly ajar, and a strange smell wafted up from below. It was a sickly, sweet odor, like something rotten, and it made my stomach turn. But Jenna insisted on checking the generator, so we went down the creaky steps, each one groaning under all weight. The basement was pitch black, and our phone lights barely cut through the darkness. We found the generator in the far corner, but it looked fine, until Jenna pointed out something strange. There were scratches on the walls, deep and jagged, as if someone, or something, had clawed at the concrete in a frenzy. My skin prickled with unease, but Jenna brushed it off, saying it was probably from some animal that had gotten trapped down there. We tried turning on the generator, but nothing happened. Frustrated, we headed back upstairs, only to find that the door we'd entered through was closed. I pulled on the handle, but it wouldn't budge, as though something was holding it shut from the other side. We pounded on the door, yelling for help, but there was no response. I glanced at Jenna, and her face mirrored my own panic. Then, from the shadows at the other end of the basement, we heard it, a low, guttural growl that made every hair on my body stand on end. Jenna and I backed away from the sound, but it followed us, growing louder, until we could hear heavy breathing, just inches away. Then, the most horrifying sound filled the room, a shrill, unnatural scream, echoing off the walls and rattling my bones. We both bolted, running through the basement, looking for any way out. Finally, we found a small window near the ceiling, just big enough to squeeze through. We pushed each other up, scrambling out and falling into the cold grass outside. I expected to see the other guests waiting for us, but the yard was empty, and the fog was so thick we could barely see a few feet ahead. We made our way back to the house, hoping to find our friends, but the front door was wide open, and the music was blaring again as if nothing had happened. I stepped inside, calling out, but there was no answer. Then, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The party was still going on, but everyone was different. The guests weren't the friends I'd arrived with. They were strangers, dressed in old-fashioned costumes, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes hollow. They moved in slow, dreamlike motions, as if they were trapped in a trance. I scanned the crowd, hoping to spot a familiar face, but there was no one I recognized. Then, I saw Jenna. She was standing in the corner, her face blank, staring ahead with vacant eyes. I rushed over to her, shaking her, but she didn't respond. It was as if she couldn't even see me. I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned, only to come face with someone in a mask, a ghostly white mask with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. The figure leaned in close, and in a low, raspy voice, it whispered, "Welcome to the party." I stumbled back, looking for an escape, but the fog was everywhere, suffocating, and every exit seemed to lead back into the same room, filled with the same silent, ghostly figures. I could hear the music growing louder, a haunting melody that filled my head and drowned out my thoughts. Desperate, I tried to wake Jenna again, but it was like she was made of stone. And then, one by one, the guests began to turn toward me, their empty eyes following my every move. I could feel them closing in, a sea of hollow faces and silent stares. Panicking, I ran through the house, calling out for help, but all I could hear was that eerie music and the sound of footsteps following me, getting closer with each turn. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I found myself back at the basement door. It was open now, and I had no choice but to go down. The basement was different this time. It was colder, darker, and filled with shadows that seemed to move on their own. I could feel something watching me, waiting, and I knew that whatever it wasn't human. I could hear faint whispers, voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, telling me to join them, to stay in Hollow's End forever. I stumbled through the darkness, my mind racing, my heart pounding, and somehow I made it back to the window. I squeezed through and ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I was far away from the mansion. When I finally looked back, the house was gone. It had vanished, as if it had never existed. I tried to tell people what had happened, but no one believed me. The party was just a memory, a nightmare that haunted my every step. Every Halloween since, I hear the music, that haunting melody, calling me back to Hollow's End, and every year, I fight the urge to return, knowing that if I do, I'll never leave again. Halloween night always brought the unexpected, and this year, I was ready to embrace it. As a paranormal investigator, I had spent years debunking myths and legends, but there was one story I'd never dared to tackle until now. The tale of Hallows Peak was infamous, a secluded hill with a single abandoned cabin where, according to local legends, a family vanished one Halloween night over 50 years ago. They were never found, and the cabin was left abandoned, becoming a ghostly fixture that even the bravest wouldn't dare enter after dark. This Halloween, I decided it was time to face Hallows Peak. I wanted to uncover the truth behind the cabin and lay the legends to rest once and for all. Armed with my recording equipment, a flashlight, and a determination that barely outweighed my fear, I set out just as the sun was setting, climbing the winding path to the peak. Its dusk turned to night. The air grew colder as I approached the cabin, and an unnatural silence blanketed the woods around me. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness that seemed to amplify every crunch of my boots on the dead leaves. The cabin loomed ahead, a dark shape silhouetted against the fading twilight, its broken windows like empty eyes watching my every step. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and a thick layer of dust covered everything inside. Broken furniture, rotting wood, and old family portraits hung on the walls, their glass frames cracked and splintered. The pictures were faded, but the family's faces were frozen in a haunting smile that sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I set up my camera in the living room and started recording, narrating every detail for my viewers. "This is where the family was last seen," I whispered, panning the camera across the room. Local legend says they were celebrating Halloween when something sinister happened. As I spoke, a soft thumping sound came from the floor above. My breath hitched, but I forced myself to stay calm. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. Taking a deep breath, I climbed the stairs, each step creaking louder than the last. The hallway upstairs was dark, the air thick with a musty scent that made it hard to breathe. I followed the sound to the master bedroom, where the door was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I froze. There, standing in the middle of the room, was a figure dressed in an old-fashioned Halloween costume, a ghostly sheet draped over them with dark eye holes cut out. The figure was completely still, facing away from me, but I could feel its cold gaze. "Hello," I managed, my voice barely more than a whisper. The figure didn't move, but the room seemed to darken around me, the shadows stretching and swallowing the weak beam of my flashlight. A sudden, icy hand gripped my shoulder, and I spun around, only to find the hallway empty. When I turned back to the figure, it was gone. The room was silent again, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the walls were closing in. I stumbled out of the bedroom, my heart racing, and hurried back downstairs. But when I reached the living room, the furniture had been rearranged. The broken chairs were now upright, the dusty table cleared, and in the center was a small jack-o'-lantern, its face twisted into a sinister grin with a flickering candle inside. A faint whisper echoed through the room, too soft to make out, but it was enough to make me freeze. I turned on my EVP recorder, hoping to capture whatever was making the sound. The whisper grew louder, repeating a single word, "Stay." Chills ran down my spine as the room filled with an unnatural cold. I tried to turn off the recorder, but it wouldn't respond. The buttons jammed as the whisper continued, rising to an urgent, pleading tone. The jack-o'-lantern's candle flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls, forming shapes that looked like grasping hands reaching out for me. Panicking, I grabbed my camera and tried to leave, but the front door wouldn't budge. It felt as if an invisible force was holding it shut, trapping me inside. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but the only response was a soft laughter that echoed through the empty cabin. Desperate, I backed away from the door, only to feel something cold brush against my arm. I turned, and there, in the corner of the room, was the figure from upstairs, watching me with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. It lifted a bony hand and pointed toward the fireplace, where something glinted in the dying light of the jack-o'-lantern. Hesitantly, I moved closer and saw a small, rusted key lying on the mantel. The figure's gaze never wavered as I reached for the key, its eyes filled with a silent warning. I didn't know what the key was for, but I felt compelled to take it, hoping it might offer a way out. As soon as I touched it, the room shifted, the shadows darkened, and the walls seemed to close in, the whispers turning into agonized screams that filled the cabin. I clutched the key tightly, feeling a surge of cold sear through my hand, and ran toward the back door, praying it would open. To my relief, the door swung open, and I stumbled outside, gasping for air as the screams faded into the night. I didn't stop running until I was far down the path, the cabin just a distant shadow against the dark sky. When I finally looked back, I saw the figure standing in the doorway, watching me with those hollow eyes, the faint glow of the jack-o'-lantern casting its shadow long and menacing across the ground. I made it back to town, shaken and exhausted, but when I checked my footage, all I found was static. Every recording, every photo I'd taken was gone, as if the cabin had erased all evidence of what had happened. The key, however, was still in my pocket, a cold reminder of the horrors I had encountered. No one believed my story, of course, but I know what I saw. Every Halloween since, I feel that icy presence watching me, waiting. The key remains hidden away in a drawer, but sometimes, on cold autumn nights, I swear I can hear faint whispers calling me back to Hallows Peak, daring me to return and face the spirits that haunt that cursed cabin. And every year, I wonder if someday, the call will be too strong to resist. When I was a kid, there was one house that every child in the neighborhood feared, the old, decrepit mansion on Ash Tree Lane, Local legends painted it as cursed, a place where shadows moved when no one was around, and the ghost of a heartbroken woman wandered the halls, mourning her lost love. On Halloween night, fueled by teenage bravado and a thrill-seeking group of friends, I dared to finally enter it. We had decided to split up to make the experience more thrilling, each armed with a flashlight, cell phone, and a promise not to scream and ruin the fun. As I moved through the first floor hallway, the dusty wallpaper peeling off in long strips, an unsettling sense of being watched crept over me. I shone my flashlight into the rooms, half expecting to find my friends waiting to jump out at me. But each room was empty, their silence amplified by the unsettling ticking of a grandfather clock that still worked despite the house's decay. My phone buzzed, a text from Lisa saying she was feeling a little off and wanted to meet up. She had been in the upstairs study, where the ghost was supposedly most active. I quickly made my way up the creaky stairs, the flashlight flickering as I went. The door to the study was slightly ajar, and I could see the beam from her flashlight shining from within. "Lisa," I whispered, stepping in. The room was empty. I searched the room, my heartbeat quickening as I called her name. Still, there was no response, only the echo of my voice bouncing back at me. And then I heard it, the faint sound of sobbing from just down the hall. My skin prickled as I stepped out, the hallway dim and full of shadows. The sobbing grew louder as I inched closer, seeming to come from behind a closed door that hadn't been there before. I opened it slowly, finding myself in a room that defied the layout of the house. It was cold, almost frigid, and there in the center stood a figure shrouded in a pale dress, her back to me, head bent as if weeping. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted in place. "Lisa," I managed to choke out, hoping, praying it was her playing a twisted joke. The figure turned around slowly, her face shadowed, save for her hollow eyes staring right through me. She raised a hand, reaching towards me, and a shiver ran down my spine. That's when I felt a tug on my arm, and I nearly screamed. It was Lisa, pulling me back into the hallway. She was pale, shaking, and whispered, "We have to get out now." We ran down the stairs, bursting out of the house and into the cold Halloween night. Our friends stood waiting, and Lisa and I were the only ones with no explanation for the terror in our eyes. That Halloween, we had taken a piece of the house with us, the image of that ghostly figure forever burned into our memories. As we left, I looked back once more, and there she was, standing in the window, her hollow eyes following us until we disappeared into the safety of the night.